Hey everyone. This is a piece by a person I believe's name is pronounced Mauro Buccheri. That's going off of what Google Translate has to tell me in terms of pronunciation, so hopefully that's correct. But the piece is titled The Persistence of Marx's Humanism from the Doctoral Dissertation on Epicurus to Capital. Section 1. The Plague. In the ubiquitous swamp of neoliberal capitalism, a time of pestilence and plagues, of zombies, vampires, and other monsters of the market, of fuzziness and uncertainty, of religious fundamentalisms and solitary atheism, of violence and repressive tolerance, of empire and multitude, of globalization and right-wing populism, of culture wars, and abject poverty, failed and failing states, of nuclear war anxieties, of despots, oligarchs, and fading democracies, of simulacra and spectacles, of favelas and World Cup soccer, Arab Springs and the banana republics of consumer society, and of academic controversies about what is or is not modernity, post-modernity, the nature of political economy, the nature of human nature, late capitalism, the aesthetic, the ethic, the truth, the dialectic, genes, memes, real, virtual, self, the other, Dasein, and so on. We know with certainty only that the survival of our species is at risk. It is even probable that we will destroy, along with ourselves, most of, if not the entire biosphere. This apocalyptic scenario is historically visible, envisioned by philosophers, writers, and artists, not to mention Hollywood cinema by Marxist conservatives and nihilists. I don't even know how to say it. Gaia, as well as Medea theorists. There are also those who believe that salvation may come from a renewed mythological and symbolic order, or revolutionary insurgent multitudes which somehow will come to the rescue of a world fallen into the void of exchange value, of universal saleability, of technological autism and idolatry, and of mindless consumerism, all shrouded in the fog of postmodern schizoid euphoria. The multitudes whose symbolic form and mythologies have been hollowed out by the hegemony of the exchange value would, by a mystical event, begin a new history of humanity. Between absolute myth and the absolutism of the exchange value, there is, however, a third way, the path traveled on by Marx himself with a sustained, passionate inquiry into what humanity had become in the inferno of 19th century capitalism, from the first writings and the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 to Capital, and l'ultimo Marx, charting us, I guess that's late Marx, I don't know, charting for us a course between an improbable return to pre-modern symbolic forms and the self-annihilation of humanity, or perhaps what is even worse, its transformation into the post-human cyborg. In the pestilential swamp of neoliberal capitalism, the quote, end of the human, end quote, the human as understood by Marx and humanism is taking place almost unnoticed. We were beginning to understand who we have been and to think about who we might wish to be when the event was suddenly upon us, human life itself reduced to surplus value. The beginning of the quote, end of the human, end quote, has been preceded and accompanied by, if not the demise, certainly the eclipse of humanism and the emergence of misguided post-humanist ideologies, even where, in the left hemisphere, it should have been housed, defended, and when historically necessary, renewed. A radical renew is now imperative not only in the light of the tragic history of the 20th century, but also of the vertiginous scientific and technological advances of the last 30 years, in particular in the fields of biotechnology, eugenics, and biopolitics, with catastrophic dehumanizing effects already visible. In short, a new humanism is indeed needed in this time of domination of the exchange value, when all can be bought and sold. How does one get out of the dehumanizing neoliberal swamp in which the contemporary world has fallen? Perhaps the question that we must ask to rethink the human against the background of humanism's historical ebb and flow and misguided transhumanist cyborg manifestos is the question with which Camus' myth of Sisyphus begins after the dismissal of metaphysics. Quote, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest ... comes afterwards. These are games one must first answer, and if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that a philosopher to deserve our respect must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, for it will precede the definitive act. These are facts the heart can feel, yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellect." End quote. Albert Camus. The fundamental philosophical and existential problem, therefore, is asking if life is worth living, and if life is worth living, then how are we to live? Camus' answer comes in the conclusion of The Myth of Sisyphus. Quote, "I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again, but Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. Sisyphus, too, concludes that all is well. This universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile, ... end quote. Oh, no, not end quote. This universe without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile, ... The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." End quote. Albert Camus. The quote, end quote, the quote, eternal, end quote, return of capitalism from every crisis is such, quote, rock, end quote. But socialist humanism also, quote, eternally, end quote, returns to regenerate the hope that Promethean Sisyphus may become Orphic Cadmus, that human creativity and wise science may interrupt the Sisyphean eternal return of the same and open up as yet unforeseen, unimagined utopian spaces of being, so that the pleasure principle may prevail over the gospel of labor. Jacques Monod's Chance and Necessity, published in 1971. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but Jacques, Jacqueques, Jesus Christ, Jacqueue, fuck it. Jacques Monod's Chance and Necessity, 1971, a significant contribution to a secular and humanist ethic of knowledge, begins with the quoted conclusion of Camus' interpretation of the myth of Sisyphus. Todorov's liberal humanism, as theorized in The Imperfect Garden, also finds in the myth of Sisyphus its symbolic order. If, as Camus, Monod, and Todorov believe, life is indeed worth living, even though and perhaps because, quote, one always finds one's burden again, end quote, but in a universe, quote, without a master, end quote, that is neither, quote, sterile nor, quote, futile, is the symbolic order embodied by Sisyphus good enough for our time? is there an alternative politically, historically, and ethically credible to liberal humanism which is on its deathbed? Let's look for an alternative in the history of humanism and of Marxist humanism in particular. My own fidelity to humanism lies in the belief that if we can at least, quote, imagine Sisyphus happy, end quote, we must begin by resisting, quote, ... resistance. Tony Judt writes, quoting Camus, quote, I am messing up today. We must begin by resisting, quote, ... resistance. Tony Judt writes, quoting Camus, was not about heroism at all, or if it was, then it was the heroism of goodness. It may seem a ridiculous idea, but the only way to fight the plague is with decency, ... end quote. Judt, 2001. Ryu, Rieux, remarks at one point, quote, you have to be mad, blind, or a coward to resign yourself to the plague, end quote. Camus. But what is the plague? It is, quote, dogma, conformity, compliance, and cowardice, end quote, Judt, which now allows neoliberal capitalism to dehumanize us as once did fascism, of which Camus' plague is an allegory. Neoliberal capitalism's forms of, quote, evil, end quote, are more dangerous than fascism because they are so pervasive to have become, quote, invisible, end quote, to seem, quote, natural, end quote, and hence believed to be inevitable. The last sentence of Camus' great novel, Tony Judt writes, quote, rings truer than ever, a fireball in the night of complacency and forgetting, end quote. Ryu, the protagonist of The Plague, knew, quote, that the plague bacillus never dies or vanishes entirely, ... and that perhaps the day will come when, for the instruction or misfortune, end quote, of humanity, the plague, quote, will rouse its rats and send them to die in some well-contented city, end quote. Camus. Camus', quote, prophecy, end quote, has come to pass. The new plague is upon us, but its ubiquitous presence remains, quote, invisible, end quote, even to those who should know better. The, quote, night of complacency and forgetting, end quote, of, quote, dogma, conformity, compliance, and cowardice, end quote, is upon us. The new plague bacillus, neoliberalism, is no longer dormant, and the day of reckoning is coming for, quote, the misfortune, end quote, of humanity, but perhaps also for its, quote, instruction, end quote. The plague has, quote, roused its rats, end quote, and sent them to die in the, quote, well-contented, end quote, cities of the globalized and commodified world of late capitalism, where human life itself has become surplus value. Nevertheless, there is a, quote, way out, end quote. The promise of a remedy that lies in the history of humanism, and in particular of Marx's, or Marxist humanism. All right. New section. Let's hope I can get through this new section without stuttering and mouth farting and embarrassing myself. Where am I? There we are. Okay. The promise of Marx's humanism from the doctoral dissertation on Epicurus to Capital. If, as William Roberts persuasively argues in Marx's Inferno, Capital should be read as a text of political theory and intervention, but also, I would argue, as an existential descent into the hell of 19th century industrial capitalism, structured according to Dante's moral ontology of the three capital sins of hell. Then Marx's humanist struggle for the emancipation of humanity according to its potential as species being begins with his doctoral dissertation on Epicurus, whose garden is a powerful counterpoint to the industrial hell on earth of 19th century England, announced in 1859 as such by Marx in the preface to a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. As a student of Greek philosophy, particularly of 3rd century BCE atomism, Stoicism, and skepticism, working on his dissertation on the difference between Democritus's and Epicurus's atomism, Marx must have known of the, quote, unprecedented, end quote, level of wonder reached by, quote, everyday consciousness, end quote, in Athens. However, put at risk by the political turmoil of the Hellenistic period and by the fragmented nature of the philosophical discourses taking place among Athenian citizens at the time, thus undermining humanism's quest for what was then the central theme of philosophical inquiry, how to live. Marx also saw the similarities between the intellectual and political crisis of 3rd century Athens and 19th century Germany reeling from the recent death of Hegel in 1831. This awareness, as one reads Marx's dissertation, becomes more and more evident and manifests itself initially as the, quote, instinctive, end quote, humanism of him who hates, quote, the pack of gods, end quote, and would, quote, better be the servant of this rock / than to be faithful boy to Father Zeus, end quote. Marx, embodied in the mythical figure of Prometheus, as Marx writes in the foreword to his doctoral dissertation, quote, philosophy, as long as a drop of blood shall pulse in its world-subduing and absolutely free heart, will never grow tired of answering its adversaries with the cry of Epicurus. Not the man who denies the gods worshipped by the multitude, but he who affirms of the gods what the multitude believes about them is truly impious, end quote, or impious, end quote. That's probably what it is, impious. Excuse me. End quote, Marx. Marx's humanism is grounded in and legitimized by, on the one hand, quote, atheism, end quote, a-theism, whose etymology may be interpreted rather than without a God, as abandoned or neglected by the gods who simply do not care about human existence, as Epicurus's philosophy emphasized, and on the other by the acknowledgement that, quote, human self-consciousness, end quote, is, quote, the highest divinity, end quote. Marx, and the foundation of free will. Prometheus, as a rebel against the gods and humanity's mentor, is indeed, quote, the most eminent saint and martyr in the philosophical calendar, end quote. Marx's humanism as a profound commitment to make human existence as meaningful and happy as the constraints of nature permit, confirmed by his lifelong engagement with and love for world literature as a source and a repository of our humanity, evolves from the original philosophical, quote, intuition, end quote, to the historical humanism of the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, where it acquires the dimension of economic alienation as the denial of our species being's potential, to revolutionary praxis in the manifesto of the Communist Party, And finally, to political economy and political theory in Capital, rooted in the ethical imperative to understand, quote, scientifically, end quote, the nature of capital's laws of accumulation and circulation. It is my contention that to leave behind the dualistic opposition between the early and the late Marx, between utopian and, quote, scientific, end quote, Marxism, socialist humanism and structuralist Marxism with its anti-humanist inclinations, Marx's humanism constitutes the connecting tissue of his life and work, of his political theory and, quote, scientific, end quote, analysis of capital. And Ariadne's, Ariadne, apostrophe S, thread never severed, always guiding and inspiring Marx to continue his search for political, economic, and anthropological truths that would lead humanity out of the hell of industrial capitalism and into, quote, purgatory, end quote, or to use Calvino's expression, at least a non-inferno, from which, as autonomous subjects, humans can pursue the Epicurean art of living happily here on earth. The contrast between the epigraph at the entrance of Epicurus's garden and Dante's warning at the entrance of hell is quite telling and worth emphasizing for what it reveals about Marx's humanism. Marx understands, as he gets ready to undertake the dangerous quest to lay bare the laws of capital, the intellectual and existential challenges facing him. He knows that the search for truth requires the renewal of the self, that the end pursued is a radical metamorphosis similar to Dante's Trasumanar, Trasumanar, italicized. It is worth noting that Marx's identification with Dante's journey implies, as for example, the references to Cacciaguida's indicative, Cacciaguida, that he is well aware his own journey has a doubtful dimension, individual and collective, as it is implicit in his notion of species being. He also knows, as Dante knew, that descent ad inferi is unavoidable, that the way down and the way up are one and the same, that emancipation cannot come without the full knowledge of and rebellion against the hell of industrial capitalism, and thus the reference to Dante's Inferno. Quote, and he to me, as one who understands, quote, here must all fear be left behind, here let all cowardice be dead, end quote, Dante's Inferno 3, verses 13 to 15. I believe that's what it says. It says VV 13 to 15. So if you know more about citations in literary works, make of that what you will. On the other hand, Marx also knew of the Garden of Epicurus, devoted to the theory and practice of the art of living meaningful and happy lives, at the entrance of which one would read, quote, stranger, here you will do well to tarry. Here our highest good is pleasure. The caretaker of that abode, a kindly host, will be ready for you. He will welcome you with bread and serve you water in abundance, with these words, quote, have you not been well entertained? This garden does not whet your appetite, but quenches it, end quote, Epicurus. We can indeed, quote, return, end quote, to Epicurus's garden, to the true materialist nature of reality and to the ethics of joy rather than being slaves of the biblical intimation to, quote, accumulate, end quote. But we must first face the heart of darkness of capital. From the perspective of an eagle's eye view, Marx's complex and vast oeuvre, fucking suck at pronouncing that way, ranging from philosophy and political theory to historiography and political economy, from journalism to cultural and political polemics and controversies, yields a clear sense of the consistency of its totality, kept together by the centripetal force of his commitment to the emancipation of humanity, whose potential for meaningful existence, now alienated by capitalism, is rooted in the nature of its species being. Marx's notion of species being, crucial, I believe, for the understanding of his worldview and defined by the capacity for agency, has its origin not only in the philosophy of Feuerbach and Aristotle, not to mention the little theorized and barely noticed affinity with evolutionary theory, but also in his doctoral dissertation where he opts for and defends the atomism of Epicurus because of the concept of swerve, which introduces, in the deterministic world of Democritus, free will as the defining trait of being human. Without swerves, no political theory, no philosophy, no science or ethics can make a difference. If we indeed live in a democratic universe, there is no hope. The only possible myth to live by is the myth of Sisyphus, the eternal return of the sane. But, as Marx argues in his doctoral dissertation, our mythologies begin with Prometheus's theft of fire and gift to humanity, with an act of rebellion and a technological swerve away from, on the one hand, the will of the gods, and, on the other, the constraints of nature. It is, to use a literary example, a transition similar to that from the laws of necessity, or ananka, that dominate in the Iliad, to the independence of thought and action of Ulysses in the Odyssey. Prometheus is indeed a proto-humanist who rebels against the gods and the rigid constraints of nature. In this view, Marx's idea of human agency has its origin in the Epicurean notion of the swerve, from which it grows into the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844's Economic and Philosophical Analysis of Alienation, the Not Yet of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, and the theorizing of ideology as false consciousness in the German ideology, which implies by contrast the existence of a universal non-doctrinaire truth, and finally to the courageous Dantean descent into the infernal logic of capital. Marx's contribution to the critique of ideology plays a significant historical role in the unmasking of what later will be identified by Nietzsche as the dominant trait of human psychology, self-deception. From this catabasis into hell, Marx returns, much as Dante does in Canto 1 of Purgatory, quote, rivider le stelle, quote, a rivider le stelle, end quote, covered with soot, but armed with the, quote, scientific, end quote, truth of capital and the not yet of revolutionary humanism. From this perspective, there is no dualistic opposition or epistemological break between the first writings of Marx and, as Marcello Musto writes in his in L'Ultimo Marx. Ernest Bloch, in The Principle of Hope, proposed, quote, a penetrating distinction between the, quote, cold currents and, quote, warm currents in Marxism, end quote. The former, writes Razmig Koyhayan in The Left Hemisphere, quote, conceived Marxism as a positive, quote, demystifying, end quote, science, end quote, whose task is to dispassionately, quote, reveal the, quote, objective, end quote, functioning of the social world, end quote, of capitalist modernity. Kautsky and Althusser, among others, goes on, Koyhayan, quote, belong to this group. By contrast, the warm currents confide in utopia and hope and admit the share of subjectivity and even, quote, belief, end quote, involved in Marxism. Benjamin, Marcuse, Goldman belong to this tradition, end quote. Bloch himself represents the warm currents and believes that, quote, their existence was legitimate, end quote, but also that the cold currents, quote, should place themselves in the service of the warm, end quote. Koyhayan, 2014. Both currents, of course, not only are present in Marx, but indeed their coexistence and equipolence constitute the originality and the enduring quality of Marx's life and works, a coexistence that for the time being must be maintained by emphasizing the need in the long run for the warm current to leave behind the cold and turn Marxism into, quote, absolute, end quote, humanism. Section 3. Coda, Forms of Rebellion. Quote, what is a rebel? A man who says no, but whose refusal does not imply renunciation. He is also a man that says yes, from the moment he makes his first gesture of rebellion. A slave who has taken orders all his life suddenly decides that he cannot obey some new command. What does he mean by saying no? End quote. Camus. Thus begins Camus' The Rebel in the search for an understanding of metaphysical and historical forms of rebellion. Metaphysical rebellion, which must precede historical rebellion, as Marx's materialism also requires, ranges from, quote, the sons of Cain, end quote, and, quote, absolute negation, end quote, to the, quote, absolute affirmation, end quote, of Stirner's, quote, unique, end quote, and Nietzsche's nihilism. The no to metaphysics, recall Marx's no to the gods embodied in the rebellious figure of Prometheus, leads to historical rebellion and to historical nihilism. However, if properly learned, the lessons of rebellion should lead to, quote, thought at the meridian, end quote, and beyond nihilism. Resistance and rebellion are indeed in the nature of our species being, and this, even if often tragically so, bodes well for the future of humanity. But if the long silence of Prometheus must come to an end, what is to be done? The new plague, neoliberal capitalism, is elusive, often hidden, quote, invisible, and, quote, to the eyes of the many, but no less real and, quote, evil, end quote, than the plague of fascism. How must then the silence of Prometheus come to an end? What articulation should the new no take? What voices need to speak out? If when Prometheus acts, when people revolt and revolts turn into failed revolutions, and they have always failed to overcome universal alienation in the specific sense of Marxian humanism, must we not then practice Camus' moderation and the patience, or, quote, slow impatience, end quote, of Magri's Tailor of and, as Etienne Balibar suggests, imagine a possible encounter between Lenin and Gandhi. Yan, 2014. Put another way, if revolts and revolutions to emancipate humanity from the universal alienation of capitalism have failed, must we not learn patiently why they have failed, try again, and fail better until we get it right? If, in Camus' words, quote, real generosity towards the future lies in giving all to the present, end quote, then, quote, all of us among the ruins are preparing a renaissance beyond the limits of nihilism, ... end quote. This meridian of thought, he goes on, in the light of the earth, quote, remains our first and our last love, end quote. Camus. A love and a joy that, quote, excludes nothing, end quote. Neither that, quote, phantom Nietzsche, ... continually evoked as the blasted, continually invoked, ... as the blasted image of ... nihilism, end quote, nor, quote, the prophet of justice without mercy who lives, by mistake, in the unbeliever's plot at Highgate Cemetery, nor the deified mummy of the man of action in his glass coffin, end quote. Camus. All, concludes Camus, quote, may indeed live again, side by side, ... but on condition that it is understood that they correct one another, and that a limit, under the sun, shall curb them all, ... end quote. To avoid the fate of Epicurus, it must be understood that, quote, they correct one another, end quote, because, quote, the only definitive crime, end quote, is excess. Nietzsche's nihilism of self-deception must turn into self-overcoming. Marx's justice must have mercy, and Lenin must, quote, return, end quote, as a man of action neither deified nor in a glass coffin. The need to end the silence of Prometheus must be tempered by the patience of the tailor of Ulm, and the dialectical imagination which reminds us of Cervantes' intimation, quote, too much sanity may be madness, and the maddest of all, to see life as it is, and not as it ought to be, end quote.